everyone, and welcome to Cancer and the COVID-19 Vaccine Updates. Dr. Yorio is with us again today to give us an update about how the current surge in COVID cases will affect you and your cancer treatment. Dr. Yorio is board certified in medical oncology, hematology, and internal medicine. He is actively involved in clinical trial research for melanoma, head and neck cancer, renal cell carcinoma, and prostate cancer, with publications in the areas of melanoma, lung cancer, and colorectal cancer. He completed his residency in internal medicine, UT Southwestern Medical Center, and his fellowship in medical oncology and hematology at UT MD Anderson Cancer Center. He was awarded Austin's Top Doctors from Austin Monthly in 2020 and 2021, the Health Care Innovation Award from Health Tech Austin in 2020, the Rising Star Award from the U.S. Oncology Research in 2019, an extensive list of publications, accolades, and additional awards. Thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you for having me, Elaine.
So we're going to get started with our first question, and I think this is one that most people are curious about and want to know, is what is the Delta variant?
So the Delta variant is just it's a variant of COVID-19, and what you see with any virus is over time they mutate and they change, so they adapt to their environment. So they're changing so that they can continue to live, right? The virus's goal is to try to live and spread forever, essentially, is its ultimate goal. And so in order to do that, it has to mutate and find new ways to infect people and be able to transmit from one person to another. And sometimes those mutations or variants may not be big or may not cause it to be more virulent. In this case, the Delta variant is is one that tends to be more virulent. So it's easier to transmit from person to person, is what it seems like. And thus, because of that, it's sort of taken over, the United States and many other countries throughout the world, and now has become the predominant variant. So even though we didn't see the Delta variant initially, we're certainly seeing the vast percentage of COVID infections now are this Delta variant. People often ask me whether or not, if they do get COVID-19, whether they had the Delta variant. And the reality is they don't check every single person for if it's the Delta variant or another type of variant. But what they do is they'll kind of take samples from, tests that are being done on a daily basis, and they're trying to get an idea of what the predominant variants out there are based on, some of the tests that are being done. And so now you're seeing greater than 70 or 80% of the COVID-19 infections are due to the Delta variant in the United States. So it's become the main one that's out there. The problem with the Delta variant has been it is easier to transmit from person to person. So they say somebody who has the Delta variant might have the ability to infect on average about 4 to 5 other people, whereas the earlier variants that we saw, it was more like they were infecting maybe 2 other people on average. So it's more transmissible. The other thing, it may potentially be more infectious and cause more things like serious illness and hospitalizations compared to maybe some of the earlier variants as well.
I just saw recently in the news, or something came across maybe social media, that there are maybe 1 or 2 more variants that they're seeing. Have you heard that that's the case, and can we have more variants as we move into the future?
Certainly, I think it's inevitable that you're going to continue to see more variants develop through time, because again, the viruses will mutate, and the ones that are the mutations or changes or variants that are successful are the ones that are going to continue to spread, basically. So you're constantly seeing new variants out there, but some of those are going to end up being more infectious than others, essentially. And so no doubts we'll continue to see more variants through time. One of interest now is something called Lambda. Maybe that's going to be one that becomes a predominant one, or maybe there's another one out there that ends up taking over at some point. And that happens with all sort of infections and viruses. I guess a lot of us sort of hope that what happens through time is, as these change and mutate, they will continue to have the ability to spread, but maybe they won't be quite as severe in the way they cause sickness. And sometimes you see that with other coronaviruses, you see that with other influenza viruses, where as they change and mutate, hopefully they become, less severe. That's the hope. So, because again, the virus wants to live and propagate, doesn't necessarily want to kill off all the hosts. So it wants to be able to be around too. So that'd be my ultimate optimism, is that as these variants happen, maybe they become less severe at some point.
Okay, so is it similar? So I want to ask about the vaccine, but another question came to mind. Is it similar as getting the flu vaccine, and I don't even think we call it the flu vaccine, we just call it a flu shot, but is it similar to that, where maybe if we do get it, our symptoms won't be as severe? It doesn't keep us from actually getting 100%, but if we do get it, the symptoms will be less severe?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I think, what you see with flu vaccines, right, is we find strains of the flu that are going to be what they think are going to be the most common strains that flu season, and that's what they include in your annual flu vaccine. And they're very effective, and for some people, they probably prevent them from getting the flu or getting sick at all with the flu, and in others, it causes more of a very mild illness for the flu as opposed to a more severe illness. And that's where the flu vaccines are really, really effective. And I think COVID-19 vaccinations are going to are somewhat like that too. Again, it's a totally different disease process. So I always say it's not like the flu in some of the symptoms it's causing, but similarly to like the flu vaccines, I think COVID vaccines, what we're seeing is that it's causing you to have a less likely chance to be infected. If you do get infected, you tend to have a much more mild illness, or even just an asymptomatic illness. And what we don't do with the flu is we're not testing people constantly for flu virus if they don't have any symptoms. Whereas with COVID right now, we're testing also lots of people that aren't necessarily symptomatic. So because of that, you're picking up a lot of asymptomatic infections, and I think what we're seeing is some of those people who had been vaccinated, they're still getting COVID-19, but maybe they're totally asymptomatic, or again have very mild symptoms, and so that's what we're seeing. I think, to me, the goal of those vaccines, I think the dream was like vaccines were going to eradicate this virus from the world, and I think the reality is that that's probably not going to be the case. But what it can do is turn COVID-19 from an awful illness that fills up the hospital with hundreds and thousands of patients to hopefully a very, manageable illness that's mild. And every now and then there's going to be some people who do get sick with it and end up in the hospital, but that's going to be much, much lower numbers. And that's kind of what we see with flus, right? Right. We still see people get sick with the flu and go to the hospital. But most strains of the flu, probably because of vaccinations and whatnot, we don't see this overwhelming amount that we're seeing with COVID-19, and certainly don't see the death rates and just really prolonged hospitalizations we see with COVID-19.
Okay. So then next question would be, does the vaccine work against the Delta variant and possibly any other strains that we might see?
So far what we see is that it does work against the Delta variant. However, it's probably not quite as effective as it was against some of the earlier variants, meaning we're seeing maybe a little bit more decrease in the effectiveness of people getting some symptoms. It's still decreasing severe illness quite significantly, dramatically, because what you see right now in the hospitals is really over 90% of the patients admitted with COVID-19 are unvaccinated. The ones that are, these are the people who are sick enough to be in the hospital, and less than 10% of those sick enough to be in the hospital are ones that had been vaccinated. So again, it's not 100% perfect, but it's showing a huge discrepancy there, and really making our odds much, much better. But you're right, I've seen different quotes throughout the world on how they're studying the Delta variant. where the effectiveness is probably a little bit less than what we saw earlier with the other variants that we had initially. And I think what will happen is there will probably be other variants out there that it's going to be similar, where maybe the vaccine's still very effective against, or maybe less effective against some of the newer ones. And probably what we're going to have to do is, much like the flu vaccines, is we have to get booster shots that ultimately they'll modify some of those booster shots to maybe be able to attack some of the newer strains better as well. So I think you'll see that develop through time.
Okay. Okay. So then we'll move into the next question, which is about the booster, because we're hearing about that. I know that, I know some people who are scheduled to go and get a booster. So can you speak to that? What is it? Who is eligible? Who should actually go get it, and who can wait a little bit longer, and then how it affects those with cancer and in cancer treatment?
Yeah, certainly. So, right now the idea of the booster shot is really giving another shot of the original, Pfizer or Moderna shots. That's where the boosters sort of recommended at the moment. They've yet to formally recommend boosters, at least at this point, for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. But we'll probably learn more about that in the coming months or coming weeks. But right now it's recommended for the Pfizer and Moderna. It's officially recommended for people who are immunocompromised. So of course, for our population, that includes people who are actively on cancer treatments of some sort, people who have blood cancers as well. So those would be the big ones. But anybody who's actively on chemotherapy, we're thinking of them as immunocompromised. Certainly some of the other treatments we give also, we're thinking of them as immunocompromised, and they should get a booster shot. If they were receiving treatments or chemo, when they got their original vaccinations, I'd include those people in that group as well. So maybe they were on treatment, 6 months ago and had the vaccination, I'd probably still include those folks. Certain other types of medicines, like, a drug like rituximab that we use a lot. We don't use that in breast cancer, but we use that in some other diseases. For those folks, probably if they received that medicine anytime in the last sort of 6 to 12 months, again, they would be somebody that wanted to get a booster shot. Anybody who's had a stem cell transplant in the last 2 years, you'd want to get a booster shot. Anybody who has had a history of an organ transplant and is on any sort of immunosuppressing drugs, we think about the booster. So those are a lot of the high-risk population that we think of as immunocompromised, that I think right now is important to get a booster. What you're going to see that I think is going to get formally recommended very soon is boosters for everyone. And I think what they'll recommend is probably about 8 months after their original vaccination. That formal recommendation has not been made by the CDC or the FDA yet, but I think that will come out here in the next month or so.
Great information. So for those patients who had the vaccine administered during chemo, did this reduce the efficacy of the chemo or even the vaccine while they were on chemo?
I think we don't fully understand that for everybody. And of course, I think it's different depending on what type of treatments they were on. So there's a lot of nuances to that, I think.
Okay.
But what I take kind of as an overall sort of picture is probably it had a chance to decrease that effectiveness at least a little bit. And therefore, it's important to get those booster shots. And what we did see in some of the studies is that people who were on certain chemotherapy drugs while they got their original vaccine do have lower kind of antibody levels than people who weren't on those type of treatments. And so again, the thought is that their immune response to the vaccine was not quite as good as what you would see if they were not on those treatments. And therefore, that's really why they're trying to push these boosters out sooner to that population.
Great. Would you speak to the status in cancer treatment and surgeries due to the surge in COVID cases? What can cancer patients expect?
Yeah, I mean, right now, unfortunately, we're seeing a really high volume of COVID-19 hospitalizations. And again, the vast majority of those are the unvaccinated population. But but it's reaching those peaks or about to surpass those peaks that we saw in January, unfortunately. So what that means is our hospitals have a very large amount of COVID-19 patients in them, and it squeezes the room for everything else too. And so I think when it comes to hospitalizations, it's made it more tricky or difficult, right? I've certainly had my own situations where it's harder for me to direct admit somebody to the hospital, or if I have to get somebody to go through the emergency room, they have to wait longer to find a bed or get a bed. We've had difficulties with transferring from, smaller hospitals to bigger hospitals and things like that as well. So that's been one barrier to just cancer treatment all around. And by and large, we're still handling those patients and taking care of them, but it's made it harder or trickier, or having to make the wait longer than what we would normally want or expect, right? Not being able to get some of the care as quickly as we'd want to sometimes. From an outpatient, clinic perspective, we're still full scale treating cancer patients, and that's never changed for us in our clinics, throughout the whole pandemic. Again, it still means being safe in clinic, wearing masks. It means less people in our clinics as well. So that to me, that's been a sad part for my patients, is where they don't have their friends or their family able to sit with them while they're getting chemotherapy or infusions as much. And it's limited some of the amount of time that their friends or close ones can come in during doctor's visits and things like that, because we're trying to limit how many people can be in the building at once and those type of things. So I think those are some limitations that have continued to happen, but again, I think we've done a pretty good job of working around those all around and still able to deliver very effective care to our patients. And as far as surgeries, as of now, certainly they've yet to sort of limit even elective surgeries for the most part. And certainly cancer surgeries, at least right now, are not affected. I think we've still been able to go forward with all the cancer surgeries as planned. So that could always change in the next month or two if the cases continue to rise and the hospitals are more suffering more. And I think the other big takeaway I'll throw out there is just, it's been a stressor on the healthcare system and healthcare workers. And unfortunately, what you've seen is a large amount of nurses and other staff leave the hospitals and leave working altogether. And so what's happened is a lot of the systems are understaffed from where they usually are, or not able to make up for this the big surge that's happening. So I always say it's not truly a bed issue. We could always make more beds probably out there, or we can turn the convention center into a hospital probably within a few weeks. But it's what's more important than beds is the people that take care of those patients, and don't have the right nurses that are there, and not just nurses, but some of the critical care staff needed, and all those folks that have that experience and expertise makes it tough. And so that's been a tough thing to see. And so I think my big takeaway is still, if you haven't gotten vaccinated, get vaccinated, so we can continue to keep those numbers lower, and do it. Nurses and those healthcare workers out there that have just worked so hard for over a year and a half through this pandemic, and unfortunately continue to have to work so hard to get through it. And if you've got friends and family that are hesitant to get that vaccine, I think really trying to encourage them is super important.
Great advice. Thank you so much, Dr. Yorio. This was very informative. Any last thoughts? I know you said you threw something else in there. So is there anything else you can think of that that someone that's getting newly diagnosed or is in treatment might want to know? Anything?
No, I mean, I think still, don't be hesitant to go out and seek care if you need it. And if you're worried about things, still go to your doctor. And at the end of the day, we still need to take care of all the normal illnesses that happen. So don't try to ignore those. So I continue to impress upon people to do that and get their screening tests and all those type of things that they need to get. And then, as I said, I think the other big takeaway is, get vaccinated and encourage everybody around you to do the same.
Get your mammograms, get vaccinated.
There we go. I like it.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.